Welcome to the program, Jordan Peterson. People right now feel this chaos and they feel they're overwhelmed and they feel like everything they do or have done doesn't make any difference. And so they're starting to unplug and they're starting to throw up their hands and get frustrated and angry. You are saying that, no. Forget about the big picture. Do these 12 little pretty simple things and you'll change the world. At least change your life.
Yeah, well, that's a good place to start, and you won't do any harm either. So, first do no harm,
right,
as the physicians have it.
So, first of all, let me just give or have you give your credentials. You are a clinical psychologist and a professor of psychology, and you have really been found and kind of a worldwide sensation on YouTube.
Yeah, I've been a practicing clinical psychologist for about 20 years. I've spent tens of thousands of hours talking to people about their deepest problems, and I've worked as a business consultant, and I've helped entrepreneurs. I've helped companies find entrepreneurs to help run them. And
I want to go through the book, and we have some time with you today, so I want to go through the book. We can't go through all 12, but I'm just going to give you the advice, and then you tell me exactly what it means and how to apply it. Rule number 2: treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping.
People are hard on themselves. Everybody's aware of their own flaws and faults and inadequacies and failures to live up to even their own ideals. And we're also painfully aware that we do things purposefully wrong from time to time, just out of spite and a desire to produce misery. And because of that, we don't feel as positively predisposed towards ourselves as we might. And so we don't take care of ourselves very well. And it's deeper than that even. We kind of have contempt for ourselves because we're fragile and mortal and subject to the tragic conditions of life. And we're not exactly sure, I would say, that we deserve the best or that we deserve to be taken care of properly. People will often treat their animals better than they treat themselves. And that's not good. It's not good. You have to detach yourself from yourself a little bit and understand that you deserve to be cared for, like at a level of basic decency, just like any other living creature, let's say. You should want the best for yourself.
I've always been fascinated by the human race because we really are self-hating egomaniacs. We build ourselves up into these all-powerful, but as individuals, we also have this self-loathing. How do you, so it doesn't sound like
people have a hard time of it. We're the only creatures that are self-conscious, and we're aware of the fragility of life and on our own flaws. And so because of that, it's very difficult for us to regard ourselves properly. And so chapter 2, rule 2, treat yourself as if you're someone that you should take care of, is a deep description of why it is that people have doubts about their own being, and then also what you should do in the face of that. The fact that we're faced with our own mortality constantly and with the human proclivity for evil means that we have a very large burden to bear, but we're also capable of doing that. And you should regard yourself positively as someone who's able to face the tragedy and malevolence of existence and still move forward, and sometimes move forward with great nobility and grace. People can operate under horrendous conditions and do so, admirably, and that's something really remarkable.
Do you think that, I just read a study this morning that shows depression rates of teenagers are up, 48%. Suicide is up 24% since 2010. And the study showed that it coincided with the use of a smartphone. One of your other rules, let me see which one it is. Here, rule 4, compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not who someone else is today. Do you think some of this is coming from we're not good enough because we don't have the life that we think everybody else has based on their bogus Facebook page?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on there. We're undergoing sequential technological revolutions, and it's not easy to keep up. And so I think we don't know what to do with all the magical technological devices that are being thrown our way. It's a very, very steep learning curve. And social media, all the major social media outlets, Twitter and YouTube and Instagram and so forth, they all have their advantages and their pitfalls. They're quite addictive, and they do throw you out into a massive realm and allow you to compare yourself to the Facebook version of everyone else. And that definitely is rough. Rule 4, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. That's a good maxim to live by, because no one else is really like you in any deep sense. I mean, obviously people have their similarities, but the conditions of your life truly are unique. You have to figure out who you are and then try to be better than that. And that's something you can always do too. And one of the things I tried to do in that rule is outline why that's good enough. Like, you can make incremental changes over who you are right now. And those incremental changes will compound and transform you across time. It's a really, really powerful way of looking at the world. And it stops you from being bitter and resentful. It's better to think about who you are now, to take stock of your flaws and your virtues, and to move forward from that foundation. That way you can have an ideal. I'm going to be better than I am. And you don't have to be bitter and resentful because you're not who you think someone else is.
I'm a 22-year recovering alcoholic. When I first started my journey into figuring out really who I was late in life, in my 30s, I stopped, and I really didn't. It wasn't a real conscious stop in some ways. And then I was motivated to continue to look deep inside of me. And I realized at that time, the reason why I think I was afraid, and I don't know if this transfers to other people, but I was afraid because I was afraid there was nothing really of value inside of me.
Yeah, right. Well, that's it. That is people's deepest fear, is that there's nothing valuable about people. And I truly believe that is deeply, deeply wrong. Like, one of the things I've tried to do in 12 Rules for Life is to take a very stark appraisal of human existence. Like, I do believe that our lives are fundamentally tragic. You know, we grow old, we get sick, we die, we lose the people we love, all of that. We're finite creatures, you know, and there is real malevolence and evil in the world, and not only in the hearts of other people, but definitely in our own hearts. And so the conditions of existence are very dire in some sense, tragedy and evil. But I do believe that there are ways of living in the world that enable us to transcend that, and that the old idea that we each have a light inside of us that, if turned on, will illuminate the world, I believe that to be true. I think that the human spirit is more powerful than death and evil, and that if you live a truthful life, and if you live a life that's oriented towards the highest good, that you can withstand the burden of being, and you can discover within yourself something that's that spark of divinity that unites you with God.
Jordan, I've been watching you now for a few months, and I saw something that you just did on the BBC, where the presenter was after you from the beginning. There wasn't an honest question, I didn't feel, from the get-go. She was trying. It was almost like every question was like, "Come on, fight with me." What is it that you're saying that is making so many people just angry? Because I don't see it.
Well, I'm calling out the identity politics types on the left, and in a really blunt way, and so they're not very happy about that.
But you're doing it. But you're doing it with facts. You're doing it with ease and gentleness and kindness.
That's worse.
I know.
That's worse.
I know.
Because what if the radical leftists have to paint everybody who opposes them as some kind of supervillain, because if the person who opposes them isn't unreasonable, then they're reasonable, and that means that reasonable people can critique the radical left. And I am a reasonable person, and that makes me more threatening rather than less. And I mean, I believe that the radical leftists have pretty much destroyed the humanities, and that's a terrible thing because they're at the core of the university. And I also believe, and there was an article in the Boston Globe just this last week making exactly the same case, that the corruption of the humanities is now spreading out into the broader public, into corporations and so forth, often through the back door of human resources. And I'm pointing all this out, the pathological legislation that's been passed in Canada, for example, requiring compelled speech that
Right.
resulted in the inquisition of a teaching assistant at Wilfrid Laurier University. And people aren't very happy with me as a consequence.
In his new book, 12 Rules for Life, he says things like this: confront the chaos of being, take aim against the sea of troubles, specify your destination and chart your course, admit what you want, tell those around you who you are, narrow and gaze attentively, and move forward forthrightly.
We were talking about before the break something that, and this was kind of reminded me of a recent article about a sort of an alt-right conspiracy gathering in New York City, and a bunch of reporters went to it, and they started asking, trying to fish around for what their ideology was, and one of them said this: "We're not ideological. We're tribal. We don't care about the politics as much as we care about pissing people off and trolling and shaking things up." Doctor, before we went to the break, you mentioned the way we are starting to degenerate into tribalism. I think people now are starting to look at tribalism as a positive. Why isn't it?
Well, people, when they lose their unifying narrative, they degenerate into tribalism. You saw that happening, for example, in Yugoslavia when the wall fell and the Soviet Empire collapsed. People degenerate back into their tribal groups. Now, look, when you move from being a child to being an adult, you have to pass through a period of time where your primary affiliation is to the group. That's what happens when you're a teenager and a young adult. You have to become socialized. You have to take your place as a member of a group. But that isn't where your development should end. You should then transcend the group and become an individual. And then you're part of the force that establishes and renews the group as well as just being part of the group. And it's that transcendent identity as an individual that enables different groups to live together on the same territory peacefully, because I can come out of my group as a forthright and honest individual, and you can come out of your group the same way, and we can communicate and negotiate, and we can figure out how to cooperate and compete peacefully and to trade and all of that without degenerating into tribal murderousness.
You say this globally. You're not just talking about the United States.
Yes. No. This is happening all over the world, but particularly in the West, and it's everywhere. And the radical left narrative is that there's no superordinate narrative. There's nothing that really unites us. The world is a landscape of competing power interests that are based on ethnicity or race or gender, these essential elements that no one can change, and that the entire world is just a battleground of power between those competing groups, and that some of them oppress the others. The right wing looks at that, the radical right, and says, okay, if the world is nothing but a battleground between power groups, then I'm going to pick my power group, whatever it happens to be, and I'm going to win. And so they both end up playing this extraordinarily dangerous group identity game. And there's nothing at the end of that except catastrophe.
He has a huge global following that has been building for a while. And a lot of them are young males. And he is not spoon-feeding them stuff, the average person in the media or, in universities would say, oh, that's what they want to hear, and you got to coddle them. He doesn't coddle them. He tells them, grow up, be a man. What does that mean, Jordan, to when you're talking to these guys? What is it they're starving for?
Well, they're starving for the idea that their life has purpose, a recognition of the idea that their life has purpose. And so I tell them, well, there's things to do out there in the world. There's chaos to confront, and there's order to establish and revivify, and there's suffering to ameliorate, and there's evil to constrain, and that the world is a lesser place if you don't take your place in it, and that the consequences of that are dire. You have an important destiny. I tell them that they're made in the image of God, like the old stories say, and that they have something beneficial. God, every time I talk about this, it breaks me up. That they have something beneficial that they have to bring into the world. It's that stops the world from degenerating into hell. And that it truly is important for you to get out of bed in the morning and to face the world honestly, and to set your family straight, and to work for your community, and to aim at something great in the world. Like, you can't just hide in the basement and shirk your responsibilities. It makes you miserable and bitter and even murderous. It's not a pathway to take. It's just good to stand up and take on the burden of the world. And that people aren't one dot and one speck among 7 billion. We're all networked together. We're all in this together. And we could do something remarkable together if we aimed high and spoke the truth.
So
that's the right way to live.
Some of your prescriptions are pretty tough for this, though. And looking at Rule 6 is one that pops out to me because this is something I've found over and over again that people absolutely despise doing with themselves, which is set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. That is something that people don't want to do. It's very difficult to do. How do you make them do it?
Well, I think what you do is what I tried to do in that chapter is about kids who shot up the Columbine High School and about a mass murderer named Carl Panzram. And I try to describe in detail the motivations for doing such things. And people who do such things have very powerful motivations for doing them. They're very angry about the conditions of existence, the tragedy that constitutes existence, and they get bitter and resentful, and then they want revenge. And they're willing to take it. Well, they're willing to take revenge on the most innocent. I mean, that's what the guy who shot up the school in Connecticut did. He went and shot kids. Like, well, how the hell do you get into a situation like that? And you brood on the horrors of existence, and you get resentful for your part in the tragedy. And there's no excuse for that. I mean, life is very, very difficult. There's no doubt about that. And unfair things happen. But to retreat and to become resentful and bitter is only to multiply the problem. For the last 50 years, we've encouraged young people to go out there and stop the people who are doing bad things from doing them. And I just think that's a counterproductive way of living in the world. It's like you should stop the bad things that you're doing, and you should straighten up your life, and then you should straighten up your family's life, and then your community's life, and then everything will be straight and proper, and that's all to the good. Then maybe we won't degenerate back into that brutal tribalism that characterized the 21st century and wipe ourselves out.
I have found these things myself over the last few years and to be true. And people will say, well, you can't surrender and retreat and you can't just let it go by. And you're like, no, I'm not letting it go by. I'm not surrendering. I'm just not playing that game because it gets us nowhere. And I can make an impact in my own home and in my own life. And that changes things.
It's not trivial either. Like, it's not that easy to set your family in order. And if you do that, you'll learn something deep. If you can make peace with your brothers and your sisters, and if you can make peace with your parents and your past, and you can make your own house peaceful and productive, then you've learned some deep psychological and practical truths. And then when you go out into the world and attempt to do things, you're going to be first on a very solid footing because you'll have lots of support and you won't be tortured by a never-ending stream of domestic hell and idiocy. And you'll be ready to do things in the world that are appropriate and proper. You'll have practice. It's not like setting your house in order is trivial. It's very difficult.
You admit that there is evil in the world, and it is profound. And I think that's
one of the most self-evident things about the world.
I know. And people will hear this, and because I've heard this from people, Glenn, there's evil, and it has to be stopped. Yes, it does. And you're just a retreat from evil because that's just not going to stop. Can you connect the dot to the chaos in our own life and then the evil that is out?
First, look to yourself first. That's the thing, is that the best place to begin the process of constraining evil is in your own heart. Like, I've studied totalitarian brutality for 30 years. And one of the things that I taught my students, since the early 1990s, is that if each of them was placed in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, there's an overwhelming probability that they would be Nazis. Mm. Like, everybody thinks, no, I'd be Schindler rescuing the Jews. Right. I'd be the Dutch family that hid Anne Frank. It's like, no, you wouldn't.
No.
That's not true. you'd be on the side of the majority, just like you are now in all probability. And if the temptation was put in front of you to do the terrible things that were offered to the people who did the terrible things the Nazis and the communists did, then it's really probable that you would do those. And it's also really probable that you're doing such things already on a smaller scale. You're torturing the people that you love. You're betraying your friends. You're not working up to your potential at work. There's all sorts of things that you're doing in your life that are small examples of the things that get out of control in tyrannical societies.
I'm sure that you have read the book Ordinary Men, on how men, in Poland, were they did with compassion at first, and they turned into monsters. It's a slow, gradual thing that you just don't see.
Oh, that's a great and terrible book, Ordinary Men. Yeah, it's one of the ones I have a reading list on my website, because that is a great example of how you move to perdition one step at a time, and how perfectly ordinary people can be trained, even against their own will, in some sense, against their own better instincts, to become, committers of atrocity.
We have a list of books to read as well, and it's quite long, but move this to the top of your list. 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. Move this up on your list of things to do or watch. Jordan Peterson on YouTube. He is so well spoken, so well thought out, and a voice of common sense that you just don't hear very often anymore. Dr. Peterson, thank you so much. Appreciate it, and we'll talk again. God bless.
Thanks very much for the invitation. It was good talking with you.
Good talking to you. Jordan Peterson again, the name of the book, 12 Rules for Life.